Our liberties we prize, and our rights we will maintain. This is Iowa Civil Rights History Podcast, where we tell stories about the contribution Iowans and the state of Iowa has made to advance the civil rights movement. Past stories are being told, present actions will be highlighted, and preparation for the future will be discussed. Here is your host, Erick and Nganyange.
Welcome to the Iowa Civil Rights History Podcast. This is the part 2 of our conversation on Carrie Chapman Catt, an iconic in the fight for women's rights and international peace. She was born in Ripon, Wisconsin in 1859, and later her family moved to Charles City, Iowa. That's where she made her name. My guest today is Karen Kedrowski from Iowa State University. And I want to stay right there because she had quite a few deaths at those few years. Because 1906, Susan B. Anthony passed.
So, so within the space of 2 years, she lost a brother, both parents, Susan B. Anthony and her husband.
Yeah.
So It was, a series of really terrible, terrible blows. And, she was quite grief-stricken. And she was also suffering from some of her own health challenges. And so her doctors prescribed rest. And her definition of rest is to go on a round-the-world cruise, which, she had to pay for it. But, she went with, a friend. And so she didn't travel alone. But, in classic Catt fashion, in every country that she goes to, she meets these incredible people like Gandhi.
I saw she met Gandhi.
And, people like, the Empress of Japan and so forth. But she also goes and she meets the suffragists, because the suffrage movement is certainly across Europe. Wherever she goes, and she travels to 5 continents, she ends up creating suffrage clubs. Outside the United States. So all over Europe, Asia, and parts of South Asia and East Asia, and parts of Africa. The only place that she didn't go at that time was South America. Ends up in Hawaii, where she actually lobbies to get Hawaiian women the vote back. Because before Hawaii was a U.S. territory, when it was an independent nation, women could vote. And then when it became a U.S. territory, they lost the right of suffrage, right? The indigenous Hawaiian women, as well as any other, nationality that was living there. So she actually worked to get a resolution through Congress to reinstate the voting rights of indigenous Hawaiian women.
Oh, wow. Yep. So she left the United States in 1907 or 1908, and she didn't come back until 1915?
Well, there were a couple of cruises.
Okay. So she was going and come back. Yes, okay. So it's not like she completely abandoned.
Right. But also, part of her interest in starting suffrage clubs nationally is that she, starting in 1902, was interested in organizing an International Women's Suffrage Association, which she did. And so as she was going around the country and getting, all of these suffrage clubs organized, she was also working with the International Women's Suffrage Association, and she was going to their national meetings, and she was their president as well, as a way of sort of, inspiring each other, getting ideas about what was happening in other countries, building a sisterhood, and so forth. And the suffrage movement, and it kept Carrie Chapman Catt apprised of what was really going on in other countries. And of course, especially in Europe, where there were some very active suffrage movements and sometimes very violent, like they were in Great Britain. Yeah, and so she built this huge network. And then she would, come back and go to NASA meetings. She was vice president of NASA for a period of time and so forth. But this was also a period for NASA that was known as the doldrums. So the president was Anna Howard Shaw. Anna Howard Shaw had a PhD and was a minister. She supported herself by giving lectures. So there was this 10-year period where no state has enfranchised women. So there's this initial burst in the far west, so Colorado, Wyoming, Utah, Idaho, and then things just kind of get stuck. And there's really nothing east of the Mississippi at all. In Anna Howard Shaw's presidency, she was distracted with having to make a living. So she traveled and did lecturing, but that kept her from organizing effectively NASA. And so Catt was recruited quite reluctantly to come back and lead NASA as president.
Okay, what year is this?
This is 1915.
15, okay.
Yeah, 1915. And apparently she only very reluctantly accepts nomination. And when they inform her that she has been elected, she throws herself on her bed and weeps.
Oh. Why? She did not want to be.
She did not want the job. She did not
Mm.
want to do the job again.
Do we know why? Oh, just because she was already done?
Yeah, she was sort of like a, been there, done that, got
Yeah.
the T-shirt, right? But the suffragists in NASA really understood that Catt had what they needed, right? She had the energy, she had the organizational skill, she had money to support herself. She had the force of personality. She said, that she was not a very good public speaker, but she was actually quite dynamic and could get out there and get, people fired up. They needed their chief, and that's what they called her, the chief.
Oh, really?
Yes. They needed their chief. She takes the helm, and in 1916 at the National meeting, Catt introduces her winning plan. By this time, of course...
What is the winning plan?
The winning plan, I think it's really clever because it has sort of 4 pieces. So everybody gets to do something. In those states that have suffrage, the women suffragists there are to pressure their members of Congress to support the national amendment.
Okay, which was going to end up to be 19th Amendment.
The 19th Amendment. In those states where it is possible to pass state levels, suffrage by state action, the suffragists are supposed to push for that state action because then that sort of commits the members of Congress from that state for supporting the federal law. And in those states where there is no motivation for sort of state action to work for and build momentum for the national amendment to help raise money. And then especially in the South, that women should work for access to white primaries, which were fully ensconced by this period of time. So
that's brilliant if you look at it, because
Right.
once you push the state and they push to the federal government, then it will be easy to ratify when it comes back
Yes,
down.
absolutely. And remember that to ratify an amendment to the Constitution, you have to have supermajorities in the House and the Senate. You
Yeah.
need 2/3 majorities. And then you also need 3/4 of the state, right? So the more states that enact suffrage by state action, they're presumptively in the column to ratify.
Yeah, because
right?
especially if you already got them to commit.
Yes, but then also it helps build those supermajorities
Yeah.
in the House and the Senate. But I like the fact that, in that whole thing, nobody gets a free pass. No matter what kind of state environment you're working in, you have a task to do. And so she is living in New York. Part of her effort is to get New York to enact women's suffrage.
And is New York where they were living before George passed?
Yes.
Okay, so she just decided to
And
stay
she
there.
was staying there.
Yeah.
And so she was really pushing for the state suffrage in the state of New York because New York was a very large and populous state. It was the largest state. It's a very wealthy state then as it is now. There were essentially no states in the far eastern, along the East Coast, that had enacted suffrage. There had been partial suffrage in Iowa. There was presidential suffrage in Tennessee. So these were east of the Mississippi, but they were not East Coast, right? Suffrage was really dismissed by a lot of people as just something that they do out there. It took two efforts, but they did. So then New York did, in fact, enfranchise women by state action I want to say by 1917, because Catt herself voted in 1918. That was really kind of a momentum shifter, because now you had, a very large, very wealthy East Coast state with a huge congressional delegation that was now supportive of suffrage.
So at this time, is the main focus to have the 19th Amendment to the Constitution?
Yes. So the winning plan is really Catt's signal that we are going to work on the federal amendment, that this is our principal objective. And while we aren't going to stop working for state suffrage, it is a means to an end, right? So enacting state suffrage then helps us build momentum for national suffrage, but the ultimate goal is the federal amendment.
Yeah, and correct me if I'm wrong, the idea was, because at this point, there were some states where allow women to vote, but it was optional. Some states could say no. You can't vote.
That's exactly right.
In Catt's mind, she just wanted to make sure this is secure.
She wanted to make sure that women could vote, period. So what was really going on in the country by this time is that there was this huge patchwork of laws. So there were some states where women couldn't vote for anything at all, period. There were some states where women could vote in every single election. Yeah. And then there were some states where they might be able to vote for president, but they couldn't vote for local elections. Or like in Iowa, where they could vote on local bond issues, but they couldn't vote for Congress or the state legislature or the president, So it really kind of depended on where you lived as to whether or not you had the full rights of citizenship. And that kind of patchwork was highly problematic to suffragists, right? And of course, a lot of, suffrage opponents, and they were opponents for a lot of different reasons. But one thing was like, well, we gave you partial suffrage for X, so that should be enough. That was one of the arguments that came along. It was like, oh no, we don't want women voting in every election. God forbid.
Are you guys gonna, now I'm thinking about that when you're talking about the archive of the newspaper, are you guys gonna get some, I guess maybe the opinion page on those newspapers with the people who were against what they were saying? It will be very interesting.
We do actually have some anti-suffragist women, because there were a lot of women who opposed suffrage, yes. And we have some of their speeches in the archives of women's political communication as well.
I need to read that.
Right. So one of the most prominent anti-suffragists was a single woman college professor named Josephine Pearson. And, in a weird twist of fate, she actually taught at the institution that I was working at before I came to Iowa State, which is, in her day, it was Winthrop College. When I was there, it was Winthrop University in Rock Hill, South Carolina. And I think it's just hilarious.
It will be interesting to read and see how far off they were based on history.
Right. Well, and I can spend a little bit of time talking about why people oppose suffrage, because sometimes when I'm giving this was like, what was there to oppose, you know, because we're looking at it with our 21st century eyes. So, one of the arguments against it is that politics was a corrupt world. And that women, if they enter... Now, one thing that both suffragists and anti-suffragists agreed on was that women were the moral force in the family and society. Women were better people than men. And that we would all be living in a state of barbarous lawlessness, except for the moral guidance of women. Right. Men left to their own worst devices would just kill each other. Right. So they both believe that, women are the moral guide for the family and for society. And what the suffragists then say is politics is corrupt and bad because we don't have women in there to improve it. And the anti-suffragists would say, politics is corrupt and bad, and if women enter into this highly masculine world of corruption, they are going to be corrupted and lose their moral superiority.
Interesting.
So the notion that, women should leave the home and the family where they have moral authority in the family is a bad idea, that it would compromise what women offer to society, right? So that's one of the arguments against it. Now, of course, the social reformers who are pushing for suffrage are also pushing for an end to child labor, for protective legislation for women workers, things like a minimum wage and maximum work day and a 5-day work week, right? These are things that are being advocated for women first by women trade unionists so that they can go home and take care of their families and that they can take care of their bodies so they can still have babies, right? So all those things that we now take for granted as worker protections started with women. These progressives that want suffrage also want prohibition because they see the demon alcohol as one of the reasons for the demise of the family, for domestic violence, for child abuse, for poverty. I mean, all sorts of social ills derive from the abuse of alcohol. So we need to get rid of alcohol, right? So imagine this, right? You have industries who hear all these women saying kids shouldn't be working when kids are damn cheap. Yeah. and they can crawl into heavy machinery and fix things that a grown human cannot do. So they're seeing labor unions and anti-child labor movements and all of that as threatening their bottom line. So industry becomes opposed to suffrage for reasons of, capitalism, right? And then the same thing, if you've got somebody saying the devil alcohol needs to be, abandoned and declared illegal, right? Prohibition is peaking at the same time. How do you think the liquor industry is going to respond, right? It was like, you want to obliterate us, right? So the liquor industry then organizes against it. So you have these social arguments, but then also the antis are really supported financially by these industrial sources of money, frankly.
Yeah. Wow, that virtue side of it is fascinating.
Yeah.
Women are more virtue, and we don't want them to get involved into this because then the whole family dynamic is going to crash.
Right. And, there are a lot of wonderful cartoons from this period about people saying that women who want to vote want to emasculate their husbands. So then they want to go out into the world and they want to abandon their babies and leave their husbands to, wear the dresses and do the, child care and the cooking and the laundry and all of that while they go out and fix the world,
Wow. Then we get to 1919, 19th Amendment get passed in the Congress. Was it June?
Yes.
June 1919.
Well, yeah. So the first, it passes through the House of Representatives, and it passes by, now remember you have to have a 2/3 majority. It passes by one vote. One pro-suffrage legislator is hospitalized and deathly ill, and he's brought in on a stretcher so that he can vote. Another one had broken his collarbone and refused to have it set until after he had cast his vote, because in order to have it set, he would have been put under chloroform. And, the anesthesia would have made him fuzzy-headed and not able to come. There was another one who was at his wife's deathbed, and she was a suffragist from New York State, and she said, you need to leave and go and vote for this. And when he was done voting, he got on a train and went back to New York to plan her funeral. It was something that almost didn't happen, right? They were within one vote. And then it went to the Senate, and it passed with a requisite 2/3 majority by a margin of 2 votes in the Senate. So, but for the change of, 3 votes in a Congress of over 500 people, the 19th Amendment would not have been sent to the states for ratification.
Do we have any women in the Congress at this time?
Yes, there is one. Jeanette Rankin from Montana And Montana, like Wyoming, has enfranchised women. And she was an active suffragist in Montana, as well as a social reformer and a peace advocate. And, like a lot of these women, she was active in many of these progressive movements, and she was elected to Congress. And so she got to vote in favor of the constitutional amendment.
Was she in the House of Representatives?
She was in the House of Representatives.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So, if Jeanette Rankin hadn't been elected, or if those other three suffrage supporters had not made it into be able to cast those votes for very good, health or family reasons, it would not have passed in 1919.
Wow. And then in August 1920,
yes, it ends up being ratified in August of 1920. So what Catt is doing during this period of time is that she goes to a state where they are organizing the state legislature, and she's collecting all of the local suffragists and gets them organized, and then she leaves because she wants the local suffragists to be the ones who are lobbying and pushing for this. She wants it to be people that are known in the state and in the communities. Things are going pretty much well, and this is another thing, is that the timing ended up being kind of weird. Most state legislatures had to call special sessions to address this because it was past the usual time. A lot of state legislatures at the time might meet only in even-numbered years, and then they would pass a budget for 2 years because, the state business was much smaller than it is now. Or they would have very short sessions. Sessions usually happened over the winter so that the farmers could go home and plant and not have to miss that. So here we are in late summer. Most legislatures are not in session. So governors have to call special sessions to deal with the issue of ratification. Now, some people believe that the timing of when this came up in Congress was deliberate on the part of those that might like suffrage but are not wild about it or don't like it at all because they don't want it to be ratified before the 1920 presidential election. Because, my God, if you're doubling the electorate, right, with a bunch of people who've never voted before, you can't predict how they might vote, so they didn't, so they were kind of hoping that it might
It's not going to get ratified.
Right, exactly. By the time we get to August of 1920, only 5 states have not considered the amendment, and they're at 35 states, and they need 36, right? And of the other 5, you have Vermont and Connecticut, where the governor is adamantly opposed to suffrage and refuses to call the state legislature into special session. You have Florida and North Carolina that are in the Deep South, and they are not going to support suffrage because it has always been clear that the suffrage amendment will enfranchise African American women, and they don't want that, right? So that leaves Tennessee. Tennessee is a border state. It has its own, unpleasant racial history, but it has, in fact, given white women the right to vote in presidential elections. So there seems to be some support for this. We get into the state legislature, and the Tennessee Senate meets very quickly and passes and ratifies. So it comes down to the State House of Representatives. The Speaker of the State House of Representatives had been a suffrage advocate, but then announces that when he's calling the legislature into session that he no longer supports the federal amendment and will oppose this. So he ends up dragging out the process. So Carrie Chapman Catt arrives in Nashville, and she ends up staying for 6 weeks because she is needed to help figure out the appropriate best strategies. Nassau and the pro-19th Amendment advocates, suffragists from Tennessee, end up setting up their headquarters in the Hermitage Hotel, which is across the street from the State House. Still is. Beautiful building. And the anti-suffragists also set up their headquarters in the Hermitage Hotel. So the second floor is NASA and Catt and the suffragists. The third floor is the anti-suffragists. The fourth floor, now this is during Prohibition, becomes a 24-hour speakeasy where the liquor industry is dragging legislators up there and trying to keep the pro-suffrage House members sopping drunk so that if there happens to be a vote, they'll be sleeping it off. But of course, they're also buttonholing them, right? So not only applying them with liquor, but trying to convince them that they really shouldn't support suffrage. So the liquor industry is there in spades, and it is operating constantly. So even though Tennessee was a dry state, and even though Prohibition was in place, the liquor industry still existed and was still a huge force. And apparently it was part of doing business in the Tennessee legislature that you shared a variety of illegal beverages, shall we say. So the lobbying effort is intense. The entire 6 weeks that they are there is referred to as the War of the Roses because the suffragists use the yellow rose as their symbol, and the anti-suffragists use the red rose as their symbol. And they would hand out boutonnieres to the legislators to put in their,
so we know how you're going to vote.
Yes, exactly. And the word is that some legislators would carry a rose of each color in their pockets, and whenever they saw a lobbyist come, if they didn't want to talk to them, they would just slip in the right color rose. So it was a mess. And, votes were switching. People that supported them in the morning might oppose them in the afternoon. Depending on what was happening, the antis, brought in Civil War veterans from the Confederacy, of course, who would sit out there and talk about their duty as gentlemen and members of the lost cause to oppose this terrible thing that's being imposed by all these outsiders, translation Yankees. And, it went on and on. So when they get to the day of the vote in the House of Representatives, both the suffragists and the anti-suffragists thought that the measure was going to fail, that they would be one vote short because they had gone over their tally sheets. And Carrie Chapman Catt was so dismayed, angry, unhappy, pick your adjective, that she didn't even go to the State House. She stayed in the Hermitage Hotel for the vote. And so the vote comes, and they're going alphabetically through the tally. And first there is a motion to table, which fails. And then they go on to vote on the amendment. And they get to the letter B. And a young man named Harry Byrne, who was 24 years old, the youngest member of the Tennessee State Legislature at the time, who was wearing a red rose boutonniere in his lapel, stands up and quietly votes aye in favor of the amendment. And there is this sort of shocked pause, and then everybody starts screaming. So the suffragists start, cheering and yelling in joy and happiness, and the anti-suffragists start screaming because they realize that they have lost. It is so loud that Carrie Chapman Catt can hear them in her hotel room in another building, right? And then, of course, the rest of the people vote as predicted and expected. And so then the question becomes why did Harry Byrne change his vote? Because he had always been sort of against this. Well, it turns out that morning, and his argument was, my constituents don't want this, so I'm going to vote against it. That morning, he had gotten a letter from his mother, who was a suffragist, who essentially said, I've been reading the newspaper, haven't seen how you're coming down. And then she goes, Harry, be a good boy. If it comes down to you, help Mrs. Catt put the RAT in ratification. And so he said afterwards that he got this letter, and he said, and I've always thought that it was a good idea to follow advice from your mother. Well, this absolutely enraged people. So the suffrage supporters get the paperwork lined up and immediately send it on a train to Washington, D.C. so that the Secretary of State can certify the paperwork and add it to the Constitution. So the Secretary of State by this time, has gotten his telegrams and he's sitting there waiting for it. And he adds it and certifies the paperwork at 2:00 in the morning, because the next thing that the Tennessee legislature does is tries to rescind their ratification. And so...
For what reason?
Because they didn't mean it. No, we don't want to do this. We changed our minds. This was a mistake that the opponents organized to get them to rescind, and it was successful. But of course, when the rescission shows up, which now leads to a whole other discussion about amendment rescissions, essentially it's too late. So the amendment has been added to the Constitution. It's August of 1920. 26 million women are either enfranchised for the first time for that presidential election or now have a constitutional guarantee
to vote
of their right to vote.
Wow.
It's an amazing story.
Yeah,
it really is. It is just an astonishing story.
It is. In 1923, she write and publish a book about women's suffrage?
Yeah. So with Nellie Schuler, she publishes what she says is the real story of women's suffrage. So preceding that, the history of the women's suffrage movement, there was a 6-volume set that was started by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony that really did shape the way that a lot of feminist scholars and a lot of women's historians and so forth understood the movement for a very long time. But Catt wanted to add her piece to it because, of course, Stanton and Anthony were dead. But even those that had worked to continue these volumes, Catt and Schuler wanted to tell their story. And it's actually quite a delightful read. They don't pull any punches. So they will talk about wrong-headed and ignorant people who, oppose them or what the issues were in one state after another. But they do. They go through every single state that voted on the ratification and talk briefly, at least, about what the argument, what they experienced in each state.
Oh, wow. Yeah. So from 1920, after the ratification of the 19th Amendment, to 1923, what is Catt doing? What the celebration look like? After the
so she goes back to New York, and she's greeted like a conquering hero, right? And there are these wonderful pictures of her in her ratification dress. Yeah. So her favorite color was blue, and she had this beautiful blue dress that she had made, and she kept having to have it remade because fashions were changing so quickly that it was going out of style. But she finally has her ratification dress that she wears for these events, and she is feted. But also in February of that year, she has founded the League of Women Voters. And so she starts on what she realizes is an enormous task, that a lot of women now have the right to vote, and they have never thought about politics because they never had reason to, right? So they might not understand how Congress works. They might not understand what the federal government is taking on or understand the issues of the day. So she has created the League of Women Voters, and she goes around the country and she's helping to organize chapters of the League to educate these new women voters, these inexperienced voters, on everything about how our political system works. What does our government do? What are the different levels of government? What are the issues on the agenda? Right. Well, and of course, at this point, one of the key issues is whether or not the United States will participate in the League of Nations. Right. So it's immediately after World War I, Woodrow Wilson has negotiated the Treaty of Versailles, which ends up being very contentious in the United States. And Catt, in her spare time, has always been a peace activist as well. So she is working, during this period, not just to get the League up and running and helping women to become educated in how to vote, but then she starts to turn her attention to peace advocacy as her primary issue. So she remains an honorary president of the League of Women Voters until her death. And she also remains as an honorary president of the International Women's Suffrage Association. But she also then really kind of returns to peace advocacy and becomes a major champion of the League of Women, of the League of Nations, and then She also works very hard to condemn the practices in Nazi Germany. She calls a lot of attention to the treatment of the Jews in Nazi Germany, to the point where she receives the American Hebrew Prize for her advocacy. She attempts to help a woman named Rosa Schwimmer, who is an anti-war activist, but also a communist, who was kicked out of her home country of Austria and had petitioned for U.S. citizenship, ultimately unsuccessfully. But Catt was her friend and did what she could to help Rosa Schwimmer gain American citizenship. And she was unsuccessful, but Schwimmer ended up dying as a stateless person. That was another part of her story. So another thing that she did during this period is that there were a lot of rumors going on, and Catt was called upon to condemn Black French soldiers who were occupying Germany after World War I, because there were people saying these Black French soldiers are raping nice white German women. Catt, instead of speaking out on that, what she did was to contact the people that she knew in Germany. And remember, she knows people all around the world now because she has been involved with suffrage. And they said, there's no such thing going on. So, she then comes back and she says, look, this isn't happening. You guys got to stop it. Not only am I not going to condemn things that are not true, but you need to stop talking about it.
Did she have any kids?
No, she did not have children.
Okay.
And it's not clear what her health issues were, though I have heard one scholar who thinks that some of them might have been related to her reproductive capacity, that she might have had some illnesses or conditions that got in the way. I don't know myself.
Was she known as Carrie or Catt? What did she prefer to be called?
Well, the people who knew her well would call her Carrie, of course. But her professional name, and if you read the newspapers and things like that, she is always Carrie Chapman Catt. Yeah. And if people shorten it, it's often done derisively. They'll do a lot of things with, puns on cats, about cat houses or the cat's out of the bag. You'll see some of those kind of punny things happening. But she always went by Carrie Chapman Catt after she married George Catt and used that through the rest of her life.
Oh, wow. Yeah. She died in 1947 in her home in New York.
Yes.
Heart failure.
Yes.
Is that what it was?
Yeah. Yeah, and she had some heart troubles earlier. Yeah, where she had some episodes that she had recovered from. But yeah.
I mean that's not bad. 80-something years old.
Yeah, she was well into her 80s, and it was clear that towards the end of her career, she was really thinking about what her legacy was going to be.
Okay.
So in the interwar period, she created an organization that was sort of like the League of Women Voters. It was called the National Committee on the Cause and Cure of War, where she collected delegates from all sorts of leading women's organizations, like what had been NASA and, the League, but also the General Federations of Women's Clubs and, national sororities and things like that. And all of these people came together to study why war happens and to come up with strategies to avoid war. Yeah. And it was really quite prominent and a well-respected organization that she headed. So, when you think about it, life expectancy in 1920 for women was in their 50s. Mm-hmm. And she was in her 60s. I think she was 63 in 1920 when suffrage had passed, right? Yeah. She could have retired. She had no reason to believe that she was going to live another 20-some years. Yeah. But she didn't. She remained and politically active. Yeah. And really, devoted herself to the peace movement. Now, this is really fascinating because she was very active in the peace movement before World War I. So while suffrage was what she was known for and it was her life's work, right? Again, as a progressive activist, she was involved in a lot of these things. So she was a member of like an organization like the Women's League for Peace and Freedom, which, by the way, still exists as an organization. And when World War I began, Catt had to figure out what to do in terms of the war. Because what had happened when the Civil War broke out is that Stanton and Anthony and the other first generation suffragists said, we're going to stop advocating for suffrage because the Civil War is more important. Let's
focus on that.
Yeah, let's focus on that, which of course then says that suffrage is important. She didn't want to repeat that mistake. But she also realized that if they kept pushing for suffrage without acknowledging this big thing that was happening, that they would be branded as unpatriotic. Yeah. So she declared that Nassau was going to be all in on the war effort. And so Nassau, as they are also lobbying for suffrage, is, you know, they're volunteering as nurses. They're doing blanket and uniform drives. They're rolling bandages. They're doing all of these other things to demonstrate that they are suffragists and they are patriotic American women, right? Well, this so incensed the peace movement, of which Catt was a part, that they kicked her out. She was
banned?
Dismissed.
Oh, yes. Wow.
From the organizations, which was painful for her because a lot of these women were also suffragists and were her friends, and they had been working together for years. And so for her to come back and create this other peace movement later is really an opportunity for her to kind of reconcile and recreate her bona fides with the peace movement after the disagreement over World War I.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. And then she donated all her belongings were donated to
right.
to the
So
Iowa State.
she donated a lot of things to Iowa State. When George Catt died, she also made a significant contribution to Iowa State as a George Catt Scholarship, which still exists. It's given to incoming freshmen who qualify. It was a $100,000 donation in 1905.
Oh, wow.
Yes, it would be $2 or $3 million today.
Yeah.
And see, this was the funny thing, is that under New York law, she couldn't give the gift from her estate outright to Iowa State because Iowa State was not incorporated properly. I don't think it was incorporated at all, but now it's a 501c3 and all these. But it was not incorporated as an entity that New York State would recognize. So what she ended up doing was selling bonds from, her inheritance, because she could have just said, sorry, Iowa State, we can't do this. Now, George Catt was a very devoted Iowa State alum. He was actually president of the Alumni Association at one point. So these are active cyclones, right? And so she could have said, sorry, Iowa State, I just can't do anything to help you because of this legal snafu. But instead, she found a workaround and donated the money in her late husband's memory. And that still exists. And then, of course, you can go around campus and like the fashion and apparel department has one of her dresses. And, if you know the right people and you're really nice, they'll let you look at it. You don't want to touch it because it's so old. Some of her papers are here. Some of her other personal belongings are here. Some of her other papers are also located at Bryn Mawr and some in the New York Public Library. But the person who disposed of her estate, Aldo Watson, was also an Iowa State graduate. She was, of course, much younger and essentially became kind of her caregiver and personal secretary in her later years after Mary Garrett Hay passed away.
Wow. Anything else?
I think out of justice, we do need to mention, Mary Garrett Hay. So after George Catt died, obviously Carrie did not remarry, but she had a companion. And it is rather contested as to whether or not they were romantically involved or if they were just close friends. What is not contested is that Mary Garrett Hay was a lesbian and that she was probably in love with Carrie Chapman Catt. Now, they were both active suffragists. Hay was from Indiana, but ended up in New York State working with Catt and lived with her for 20 years. And they are buried next to each other in Brooklawn Cemetery. Hay preceded Catt in death by about 20 years. Again, she had a heart attack one morning and just died. And apparently, again, Catt was deeply grief-stricken. Whether it was the loss of a lover or a loss of a dear friend. Yeah. Either case, you can understand why she would be grief-stricken.
Yeah.
And of course, a lot of people make a big deal out of the fact that they are buried next to each other. But I would remind people that Leo Chapman had died 40 years earlier and was buried in a family plot. And George Catt donated his body to science. So he did not have a grave, right?
Yeah.
So, I think there are good reasons why she wasn't buried next to either one of her husbands. So it would make sense that if she was sharing her life with someone, either romantically or as a dear friend and close friend and coworker, that you can see why they might have chosen to be buried next to each other.
Yeah.
So it's not clear, but a lot of people there's a lot of really interesting scholarship that is pointing out that a lot of feminist activists in the suffrage movement were in fact lesbians. The scholars who've been looking at this say that the suffrage movement appealed to a lot of lesbian women because they had no representation politically, right? If you were a married woman, the argument is that your husband is your representative politically, right? There is somebody who is looking out for your interest and acting on them at the ballot box. But if you're an unmarried woman, you don't have anybody who's doing that for you. But I also think, too, that a lot of single women, whether they were gay or not, were likely to be highly educated because they had to support themselves. And if they were highly educated, they probably had more political efficacy and organizational skills and would be, I think, attracted to a movement such as the suffrage movement.
Yeah. So was she buried in New York?
She's buried in New York.
Okay. Anything else?
Well, I really think that since we are talking about civil rights history, that we need to acknowledge that there was racism in the suffrage movement. And, certainly one of the reasons for the opposition to suffrage was that it would enfranchise African-American women. And that was also one reason why the South was solidly opposed to enfranchising women either at the state level and certainly not at the federal level. Yeah. And a lot of people, I think, in recent years have pointed to some things that both Alice Paul and Carrie Chapman Catt did that they see as racist. I think one of the most important things about Catt to do, though, is to look at her deeds. There were several efforts to water down the federal amendment to either insert the word white or to substitute the amendment with some complicated language that would say essentially, we are ordering the states to enfranchise women, but they get to pick which ones they want to enfranchise, right? It was called the Shafroth-Palmer Amendment, and it was very tortured language. But the idea is that they wanted to overcome the opposition to suffrage that was based in race. And Carrie Chapman Catt opposed any efforts to water down suffrage and to limit it to white women only. And she was very open and published things where she talked about the fact that Black women would be enfranchised. So I think that part of the story is an important part of the story, that suffrage could have been
completely
it could have been enacted potentially earlier than it was, but it would have come with a significant compromise. Another thing that I heard a lot, especially in 2020 when we were celebrating the centennials, that people would say the suffrage amendment was limited to white women only, and it was not. So women who lived outside the Deep South including in Iowa, Black women were enfranchised in 1920. And the earliest record that we have of a Black woman running for office was in 1923 in Connecticut, right? And we do know that some indigenous women were enfranchised. Now, in order to be enfranchised, either an indigenous man or an indigenous woman, any person had to renounce their tribal citizenship. Needless to say, there weren't a lot of people who were willing to do that, right? Until 1924, when the Indian Citizenship Act was passed. So, yeah, did it reach every single adult woman in the country? No, but it reached more of them than what suffragists were often given credit for. And I think that's a really, really important point to make.
Amen to that. Well, Karen, thank you very much.
This was fun. Thank you so much, Eric.
Yeah.
And thank you for what you do with this podcast. And I'm glad that you tell these stories.
Thank you very much.
It's been my pleasure.
All
What
right.
a great way to spend an afternoon.
Thanks, Karen.